The fog rolls low over the mountains of eastern Kentucky, thick and heavy as if trying to smother what still breathes beneath it. Locals call the place Briar Hollow, but most just refer to it as the valley that God forgot. Roads don't lead there anymore, just trails of dirt and memory, winding through a forest that hums with secrets. If you stand quiet enough, you might hear them, the distant cry of something that sounds like a child, but not quite. It's said that long ago, a woman named Claymore lived in those woods, in a cabin swallowed by vines and silence. No one knew much about her, only that she was the last of a line too proud, too secretive, and too twisted to mix with the outside world. The Claymores had lived and died in that same hollow for over 100 years, marrying within their own blood, convinced it kept the family pure. But purity is a strange thing when it festers in darkness. When Eleanor came of age, her brother Silas built her a cabin beside his own. The two were seen less and less in town, until they stopped coming altogether. Years passed. Then came the rumors of children with pale eyes that glowed in the dark, of voices whispering from the creek bed after midnight, of animals found torn open without a drop of blood spilled. Some say she bore 5 children, all from the same man, her brother. Others swear the number was higher, that the woods themselves claimed what the Claymores tried to hide. Most folks don't talk about Briar Hollow anymore. The few who've gone looking never return the same, their eyes dart to the tree line at night, their voices drop when the wind shifts. They say the bloodline still lingers there, watching, waiting. And if you ever wander too far off the main road, past the rusted gate half buried in earth, you might just hear Eleanor's lullaby, soft, broken, and humming from somewhere deep inside the trees. Briar Hollow lies tucked between the jagged ribs of the Kentucky Appalachians, where the mist never quite lifts, and the sky seems permanently bruised. It is not on any map, not anymore. What was once a rough mining route was long ago reclaimed by the forest, swallowed by roots and rain, until only fragments of the old road remain, black stones jutting like broken teeth from the mud. Locals in the nearby towns speak its name quietly, as though afraid the hollow itself might be listening. No one goes there without reason, and no one ever goes twice. The place feels older than the country around it, untouched by the passage of time, like a wound that never healed but never bled out either. The air carries a smell that doesn't belong anywhere else, damp pine, rust, and something faintly metallic, like the trace of blood left on iron. Trees twist unnaturally toward the valley's center, bending as if drawn by some unseen weight buried beneath the soil. In the daylight, Briar Hollow looks merely abandoned, a forgotten patch of land the world outgrew. But as night falls, the shadows lengthen in ways they shouldn't, curling and shifting even when the wind stands still. The silence there isn't peace, it's pressure. The kind that makes you aware of your heartbeat, your breathing, your fragility. Decades ago, a handful of families settled there, drawn by coal seams and seclusion. They came to escape the law, the war, or the world, no one quite remembers which. Over time, one family remained when all others moved on, the Claymores. Their cabins still stand, rotting into the earth, their chimneys cracked and filled with nests. If you were to walk among them, you'd find children's toys carved from bone, crosses made of twigs hanging from doorframes, and faded footprints burned into the warped floorboards. The land seems to breathe there, sighing with each gust of wind that crawls down from the ridge. Some old-timers say you can hear voices in the fog, not words, just the low murmur of something human, distant but near enough to chill your skin. Others tell of lights flickering deep in the woods, too steady to be fireflies and too high to be lanterns. There are no animals in Briar Hollow. Even the crows refuse to perch on the trees. When the sun sets, it vanishes completely behind the mountains, leaving the hollow drowned in shadow long before night reaches anywhere else. It is a place where time forgets to move forward, where the forest grows thick over sins that were never buried deep enough, and where the air still holds the memory of screams no one remembers making. The Claymore family had lived in Briar Hollow for as long as anyone could remember, though no one alive could say exactly how they came to settle there. Some claimed they were descendants of Scotch-Irish miners who fled debt and the law. Others whispered that they had always been there, older than the churchyards and the roads that led to them. Whatever their origin, the Claymores were a family apart, bound to the land, bound to each other, and bound by a secret that grew darker with every generation. They kept to themselves, rarely venturing beyond the mountains, and when they did, their pale faces and strange, unblinking eyes made even the kindest townsfolk step aside. It wasn't cruelty that kept people away, it was instinct, a deep, primal unease that told them something wasn't right. Over the years, rumors took root like weeds. People said the Claymores didn't take spouses from outside the hollow, that their family tree wound in on itself like a snake devouring its tail. They believed that purity of blood was sacred, that the sins of outsiders would poison their line. Marriages between cousins were common, then between uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters. It was not love that drove them, but fear of the world beyond the hills, fear of change, fear that their kind would disappear if mixed with another's blood. They built their lives on that fear, turning it into a twisted faith. Old records from the county courthouse told strange stories, birth certificates missing fathers' names, death records with the same surname repeated generation after generation. But paper trails fade, and so did the memories of those who questioned too much. By the early 1900s, the Claymores had almost vanished from local gossip. The family stopped coming to town altogether. The last known sighting was of a man named Silas Claymore, tall and thin, trading a pile of furs for salt and kerosene. The shopkeeper remembered his hands trembling as he paid, and his eyes glassy, colorless, and vacant, as though they'd seen too much and understood too little. As time passed, their isolation turned to decay. The family's features began to blur, their voices grew low and slurred, and the once proud homestead fell into ruin. Yet, through it all, they clung to their belief that their blood was sacred, chosen, and eternal. Outsiders called it madness, but within the Claymore walls, it was doctrine, recited from birth to death. They said that mixing blood invited death and damnation, that only those of the same flesh could preserve the line. What began as superstition hardened into ritual, and soon, even the children of the Claymores were born knowing the one rule that mattered above all: the family must never be divided. The moment she came into the world, under the blood moon's red gaze, the air in the cabin felt thick with foreboding. It was the kind of night where the wind held its breath, and even the trees seemed to hesitate in their rustle. The midwife, an old woman with trembling hands and hollow eyes, arrived just as the moon slipped behind a thin veil of clouds, staining the world in deep crimson. The cradle rocked gently, though no lullaby was sung, and when Eleanor's first cry echoed through the timbered walls, the midwife froze. Her eyes lingered on the infant's face long enough for the mother, giant-eyed and silent, to notice. Something in that stillness warned the midwife that she was witnessing more than a birth. The infant's eyes, she reported later in hushed whispers, were too bright in the dim light, glowing faintly like embers dying in ash. A crack, the midwife thought, in the natural order. The brother, Silas, stood in the doorway, watching but saying nothing, his shadow falling long and strange across the rough-hewn floor. The moonlight touched the cradle, turning the wood to something pale and unnatural, as though washed by sickness rather than light. Outside, the forest seemed to press closer, the trees bending inward, as if curious and hungry. The midwife, her breath caught in her chest, reached for the lantern and found the flame quivering. By dawn the next day, the moon's red light had gone, but the hollow remained colored by its memory. Eleanor lay asleep, the baby in her arms, and Silas helped with the offerings of new whiskey and cornmeal, ancient gestures for protection, though the midwife wondered what they were protecting against. The adults exchanged no words, yet something passed between them, a pact, a mask lifted then replaced. The midwife left shortly after, carrying the smell of stale tobacco and something darker, something unspoken. She could not say what she had seen, only that the valley itself exhaled relief when she crossed back onto the main road. In the years that followed, the blood moon birth became legend among the few who dared speak of the Claymores. They said that Eleanor bore her first child amidst that lunar omen, and that the child didn't cry like the others. The cabin's windows were always shuttered from sunset to sunrise, and the parents spoke to the children in hushed tones, teaching them about the world outside and how it must be kept at bay. The blood moon became not just an event but a stain, a myth creeping into the edges of their lives, a reminder that in the deep hollows of the mountains, nature doesn't yield to simple truths, and sometimes the blood of the moon is only the beginning of a darker inheritance. Eleanor and Silas Claymore grew up together in a world untouched by the rest of Kentucky. The hollow was their cradle, their school, and their prison, hemmed in by mountains that seemed too tall to climb and woods too dense to escape. Their parents died when they were still young, leaving behind a decaying cabin and a legacy whispered through the valley, a warning that had already come too late. The two children were inseparable from the start, bound not only by blood but by solitude. In that place, love had no boundaries because there was no one else to show them where those boundaries should be. What began as childish dependence grew into something darker, something born from isolation and need. Silas was older by 3 years, quiet and brooding, his face always half hidden by the shadow of his hat. Eleanor followed him everywhere, from the creek where the fog lay thick on the water to the ridges where the wind howled like a living thing. He taught her to set traps, to skin rabbits, to read the clouds for signs of rain. They shared everything: food, shelter, secrets, and as the years passed, the world beyond their valley became a distant myth. They heard stories of towns with lights that never dimmed and roads that stretched endlessly, but those belonged to another kind of people they would never be. When adolescence crept in, the air between them changed. There were no church bells in Briar Hollow, no sermons, no voices of reason to warn them of sin. Only the whisper of the forest and the heavy silence of their home. What they did was not born of passion but of inevitability, the kind that grows where no other path exists. It began quietly, lingering glances, hands brushing too long, nights spent by the same fire when the cold crept through the cracks in the cabin walls. By the time Eleanor was 17, the bond between them had shifted into something both tender and cursed. The townsfolk noticed the change when Silas stopped coming down the mountain altogether. The last trader who saw him swore that Silas looked different, his eyes hollow, his voice soft and strange, as if he was guarding something fragile and forbidden. Within a year, whispers began to spread of a woman's voice echoing through the hollow, singing lullabies to no one. Those who listened closely claimed they could hear two voices overlapping, one calling, one answering, both bound in a rhythm too close, too familiar. Whatever humanity remained in them was swallowed by the hills, and the brother's promise to protect his sister twisted into something unrecognizable, a pact forged in loneliness that would stain every generation that followed. The first child came during a spring storm, when the creeks overflowed and the mountains bled mud into the hollow. The cries from the cabin echoed against the rain, sharp and short-lived, before vanishing into the roar of thunder. No one saw the baby for weeks afterward. When Silas finally came down to trade, his clothes were stained and his eyes dull, his voice so low the shopkeeper had to lean in to hear. He spoke only of needing salt and cloth, nothing else. Word spread quickly that Eleanor had given birth, but no one dared ask who the father was. The Claymores had always been strange, but now they were something else, something the townsfolk feared to name. As the years passed, more children followed, each one born deeper into silence. Eleanor rarely left the cabin, her once bright face pale and drawn. The windows stayed shuttered even during daylight, and when smoke rose from the chimney, it carried an acrid smell, as though something other than wood burned inside. 5 children in total were said to live in that house, though no one ever saw them clearly. A passing hunter once claimed he'd glimpsed them at dusk, figures darting between the trees, moving on all fours, their skin pale enough to catch what little light filtered through the canopy. Others said they had voices too soft, too slow, like words from someone learning to speak for the first time. The Claymore children were not sent to town, not baptized, not known by any names that could be written down. When the county sent a census man to record the families of the mountain, he found the Claymore cabin locked and silent. He left food by the door and went back down before nightfall, shaken by what he thought he saw behind the cracked curtains, eyes reflecting light where no lantern burned. The story of those children spread from one village to the next, growing more twisted with each telling. Some said they had no pupils, others swore their limbs were too long, their fingers jointed wrong. By the time the youngest was born, Eleanor had stopped speaking altogether. Silas was the only one seen outside, tending the traps and the graveyard of rusting tools behind the cabin. The sounds that came from the hollow at night no longer resembled human cries. They rose and fell like the wailing of wind through hollow bones, filling the valley with a mournful rhythm that sent even the bravest men running. In the stillness that followed, the forest seemed to lean closer, as if guarding the secret the Claymores could no longer hide. What began as love had turned to a curse, and what they had brought into the world now belonged more to the hollow than to them. It was the summer of 1937 when a state census worker named Thomas Alden found himself lost somewhere between two forgotten ridgelines in eastern Kentucky. The map he carried was already yellowed with age, its ink smudged from sweat and rain, and by the time he realized he had taken the wrong turn, the road had thinned into a trail of mud and roots. He was not supposed to be that far north, but curiosity and duty pulled him deeper into the wilds. Locals had spoken in low tones about a place called Briar Hollow, though most insisted it no longer existed. Alden, determined to finish his work, followed the sound of running water until he saw smoke curling faintly above the trees. It was there he found the Claymore home, a cabin so weathered it seemed grown from the forest itself. The house sat in a pocket of silence, no birds, no wind, no sign of life beyond the slow sway of the front door on its hinges. He called out, but only his voice answered him, echoing back thin and hollow. The air carried a sweet, rotting odor, something between damp earth and spoiled meat. When he stepped onto the porch, the wood bowed beneath his weight, groaning like it hadn't been touched in years. Through a crack in the curtain, he glimpsed movement, quick, deliberate, low to the ground. He froze, unsure if it was human or animal. Gathering his nerve, he knocked, once, twice, then heard footsteps retreating deeper inside. A woman finally appeared, pale as ash, her hair tangled and gray despite her youth. She didn't speak at first, only watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. When Alden introduced himself, she nodded faintly and opened the door just enough for him to see the dim interior, walls blackened by soot, shelves lined with jars of murky liquid, and in the corner, a cradle that seemed far too old for any child still living. The smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. From somewhere down the hall came a soft sound, like humming or breathing through water. He called out again, asking about the children listed on his census sheet, but the woman's expression hardened. She shut the door without a word. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of figures standing in the tree line, small, motionless silhouettes, their faces pale in the gloom. When he blinked, they were gone. He hurried back to his car, his hands trembling as he started the engine. Later, when he tried to write down what he saw, his notes became confused, frantic, almost incoherent. The last legible line read, "There are eyes in that house that do not belong to the living." He never returned to Briar Hollow, but those who read his report said it reeked of fear and something else, the sense that what he found there wasn't meant to be found at all. Weeks passed after Thomas Alden's visit to Briar Hollow, and when the state office realized he had not returned with his final reports, a small search party was sent into the mountains. They found his car abandoned near a washed-out bridge, the doors locked from the inside, his suitcase still on the back seat. The engine was cold, though it hadn't rained in days, and the tires were sunk deep into the mud as if the car had been sitting there far longer than it should have. Inside lay his notebook, its pages damp but legible, filled with erratic handwriting that began orderly and professional, then devolved into uneven scrawls and smudges. The last entries spoke of a cabin hidden by the trees, of a woman with colorless eyes, of children who moved wrong. The last page contained only one sentence, repeated 3 times, the ink darker with each attempt, *, the children are in the dark. *. The men who found the car didn't stay long. The woods felt strange that morning, heavy and close, as though the air itself resisted being breathed. Birds were silent, and the insects that normally swarmed the undergrowth were nowhere to be found. One of the searchers, a deputy from the nearby town, swore he saw something just beyond the ridge, a figure moving between the trees, small but fast, its pale skin flashing through the shadows. No one believed him until they heard it too, a sound like laughter, soft and distant, coming from the direction of Briar Hollow. By the time they reached the edge of the valley, the sound had stopped, and not one of them dared go farther. The search was officially ended 3 days later, and the report claimed Alden had likely become lost and drowned in the nearby river. But among the local officers, the story didn't sit right. His car had been locked from within, his keys still in his pocket, and there were long scratches along the door, deep, parallel grooves that looked like fingernail marks. The deputy who first found the vehicle stopped talking about it altogether after he woke one night to find muddy footprints on his porch, small ones, leading up to his door and stopping there. In the months that followed, 2 more people went missing near the same area, a hunter and a mail courier. Both were last seen heading toward the old mining trails that led into the hollow. Their bodies were never found, and the sheriff's office quietly removed the route from all official maps. Locals began burning lanterns in their windows at night, a habit born of fear, whispering that Alden's spirit still wandered those woods not because he was dead, but because he had seen something he was never meant to see. By the time the search for Thomas Alden had been forgotten by the state, the people in the nearby towns had already learned to fear the nights when the wind blew from the north. It carried with it a sound unlike anything they could name, a thin wailing that rose and fell like a child crying underwater. Those who lived closest to the ridge swore it came from Briar Hollow, though the place was miles away and long thought deserted. Dogs would bark endlessly on those nights, facing the tree line but never daring to cross it. Lamps flickered without reason, and the woods themselves seemed to move, the trees shifting as though something unseen passed between them. No one could prove it, yet every man, woman, and child in the valley knew that something was still alive in that cursed stretch of forest. The stories began to spread again, whispered in churchyards and general stores after dark. Travelers spoke of lights glowing deep within the woods, steady, deliberate, and far too bright to be lanterns. The old miners said they looked like eyes, hundreds of them, glimmering just above the ground. Some claimed to have seen shapes moving through the fog, hunched and slow, trailing the edges of the road but never stepping fully into view. Hunters stopped going near the hollow altogether after one returned babbling about voices calling his name, though he swore he had been alone. He left town the next day and never came back. Farmers began finding strange things near their property lines, animal carcasses drained of blood but untouched by teeth, small handprints pressed into the mud, and once, a doll made of sticks bound with human hair. The sheriff tried to dismiss it all as superstition, but even he avoided the mountain road after sundown. The older folks remembered the Claymore family and muttered that their curse had taken root in the land itself. Some believed their children still lived out there, neither living nor dead, breeding in the dark like something feral and forgotten. One autumn evening, a group of teenagers from a nearby town decided to test the legend. They drove as far as the old mining trail and killed the engine, laughing at their own fear. The laughter stopped when the woods went silent. Every sound, crickets, wind, even the distant river, vanished all at once. Then came a whisper from the trees, faint and breathy, like someone repeating their names. The car doors slammed, and the tires spun through gravel as they fled. When they reached the main road, they realized something else. Their headlights had gone out halfway through the hollow, and when they checked the glass the next morning, it was covered in small, greasy handprints. After that night, no one spoke of going back. The hollow had reminded them that it was still watching, still waiting, and still very much alive. Decades later, long after Briar Hollow had faded from maps and memory, a young anthropology student named Lila Warren stumbled upon the name Thomas Alden in an archive box in a Lexington University basement. She was researching folklore in Appalachian isolationist communities, but the contents of Alden's file were unlike anything she had seen: weathered census documents, missing person reports, and a small, water-stained notebook filled with nearly illegible handwriting. The margins were marked with strange drawings, crude sketches of faces with hollow eyes and long fingers, diagrams of a cabin floor plan, and notes about children who shouldn't be. Most pages ended abruptly, as if written in panic. Lila's curiosity deepened into obsession, and she made the decision that would change everything: she would find Briar Hollow herself. Locals warned her against it, of course. In the nearest town, an old man at the diner told her the valley was cursed, that even the birds wouldn't cross it. He said he'd once seen a light moving through the trees there, brighter than fire, slower than lightning, and that it didn't belong to anything alive. Lila dismissed the superstition as folklore, a remnant of Appalachian myth. She packed her camera, a small recorder, and Alden's journal, following his rough notes and the coordinates he'd scribbled decades ago. The road to the hollow was little more than an animal path now, half swallowed by undergrowth. Trees stood unnaturally close, their trunks bent as if straining toward her. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. Even her footsteps seemed muffled by the moss and soil. She found remnants of what might once have been the mining road: rusted rails, a collapsed bridge, and fragments of glass catching the dull light like teeth. The air grew thick, damp, and cold. Every now and then, she thought she heard movement behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing except the faint rustle of leaves that didn't seem to move in any wind. As dusk fell, she found the cabin. It looked exactly as Alden had described, leaning against the hillside, its roof caved in, its windows covered with something that wasn't quite wood or cloth. She stepped inside with her recorder running. The air smelled of mildew and old smoke. Dust swirled in the faint light, and somewhere within the shadows came a sound like breathing. On a table by the wall, she found a single object untouched by decay, a child's toy carved from bone, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. When she picked it up, her recorder caught a faint whisper, a woman's voice, slow and trembling, saying her name as if it had been waiting for years. Lila fled the cabin before nightfall, but the whisper followed her down the trail, and even when she reached her car, the voice hadn't stopped calling. When Lila returned from Briar Hollow, she was not the same person who had gone in. Her classmates noticed the change immediately, the way she jumped at small sounds, the way her eyes seemed fixed on something distant even in a crowded room. She stopped sleeping, claiming she could still hear the voice from the woods whenever she closed her eyes. Her research notes grew increasingly erratic, filled with fragmented sentences, drawings of symbols carved into tree bark, and phrases copied from Alden's journal as though she were continuing his work. The last entry she made before disappearing was simple. The Claymore bloodline never ended. It only hid. Weeks later, her advisor went to her apartment and found the door unlocked. Her bags were gone, her phone left behind, and on her desk lay the small bone toy she had brought back from the cabin. It was cracked now, as if crushed by something heavy, and the inside was lined with tiny teeth that hadn't been there before. Her recorder sat beside it, still running, the tape looping over and over the same faint sound, a lullaby, sung by a woman's voice, barely audible beneath the static. The police searched the mountains for days, but they found no trace of her except for her camera buried in the mud near the old mining road. The last photo showed the cabin from a distance, but in the window's shadow, a shape could be seen watching, small, pale, and unmistakably human. After her disappearance, the towns near Briar Hollow fell silent again. The story made local headlines for a few days before being buried under newer tragedies. But those who lived close to the ridge swore that strange things started happening again, the return of the lights, the whispers drifting through the trees, the faint sound of a woman singing to unseen children. Hunters found tracks in the soil too small for adults, too wide for any known animal. The forest seemed restless, its quiet broken by soft thuds at night, as if something large and many-legged was moving just beyond the reach of sight. Some say the Claymore blood still runs in those woods, that the children of Eleanor and Silas never died but adapted, their bodies reshaped by generations of darkness. Others believe Lila became one of them, drawn into the legacy she tried to expose. No one dares enter the hollow now, not even during daylight. The trees have grown taller, denser, and the path that once led there has vanished beneath moss and roots. But sometimes, on still nights when the fog hangs low, travelers on the highway swear they can see a figure at the edge of the forest, a woman with tangled hair, holding the hand of something small that glows faintly in the dark.